Wyoming Territory, 1883. The morning frost still clung to the porch railings when Ranger Holt found the woman huddled beside his barn, her arms wrapped tight around two shivering children. He stood there, boots planted in the frozen dirt, watching the steam of their breath rise in the cold air like ghosts trying to flee. "You lost?" Ranger asked, voice low and even. The woman blinked up at him, her lips cracked from wind and cold.
"No," she said.
"Just outta options." She had a steadiness in her eyes that caught him off guard, grit, not desperation. Beneath the dirt on her face and the threadbare shawl, she carried the kind of strength that held things together when they should have fallen apart. "I'm Georgia Dale," she said, standing slowly. "These are my boys, Rowan and Russ." The taller boy looked about 9, the other maybe 6, both thin and pale. George's arms rested protectively on their shoulders. "We came from Kansas. Their pa left last spring, and I could not pay the debt on the land. The bank took it. We walked most of the way." Ranger looked at her boots worn through at the toes. "You walked from Kansas?" "Not all in one stretch. Some wagons let us ride. Others didn't." He glanced back toward his house, smoke curling from the chimney. He had not had a soul in there since his cook left last winter, fed up with the isolation. He mostly lived on beans and coffee now. His ranch hands bunked out by the corrals, and he kept to himself. But something in George's voice, flat and honest, not asking for pity, stuck with him. "I need someone in the kitchen," he said. She blinked. "You offer me a job?" "I am. It comes with a roof, a warm stove, and 3 meals a day. For them too." Georgia looked at her boys. Russ leaned against her hip, his small face buried in her skirt. Rowan stood stiff, watching Ranger like he was trying to figure out whether to fight or run. "You want me to cook? You any good?" "I can stretch a scrap of bread and a potato across 3 plates. That good enough?" He nodded. "It will do." The first days passed quiet. Georgia stayed to the kitchen, rising before the sun. Ranger heard her humming softly as he saddled his horse. By supper, the little house smelled of salt pork and cornbread. She never asked for anything. Just worked,
Cleaned. Cooked.
Her boys sat quiet at the end of the table, eyes wide in the warmth of a real home. Ranger had not meant to notice the curve of her jaw when she leaned over the stove, or the way her voice softened when she read from the old Bible to her sons at night. But he did. One evening, after supper dishes were washed and the boys were tucked in the small room off the kitchen, Ranger lingered by the hearth. Georgia was stitching a torn sleeve, her fingers working fast and quiet. "You always been alone?" he asked. She looked up, thread pinched between her fingers. "Thought I was not supposed to talk about the past." "You're allowed." She hesitated. "Married young. Thought he was good. He left when the crops failed. Took the mule and the rifle. Left me with the boys and a field of dead corn." Ranger nodded, jaw tight. "You?" she asked.
"No."
"Never met a woman who wanted this life. Too much dirt. Not enough company." She smiled just barely. "Some of us do not have the luxury to choose." Days turned into weeks. Snow fell hard, blanketing the ranch in silence. Georgia baked more, filled the kitchen with warmth and butter and calm. The boys laughed now, their cheeks growing rounder, color returning to their faces. Rowan followed Ranger around the barn, asking questions about horses and ropes and how to shoot. One night, Ranger came in late. Georgia had kept a plate warm for him. He sat at the table, half-starved, scarfing down the biscuits and stew. She watched from the stove. "You work too much," she said softly. He glanced up. "You calling me lazy?"
"No."
"I am saying you look like you have not slept in a week." He laughed, quiet and surprised. "You always this forward?" "Only when I care if someone drops dead in front of me." His spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. Their eyes met. It hung there, the silence between them. Not heavy,
Not awkward.
Just real. You care? He asked. She swallowed. I do not know when it happened.
But yes.
He pushed back his plate, walked over until he stood just beside her. Close enough to feel the heat from the stove and her skin. Close enough to see the gold in her eyes. You are not alone anymore, Georgia. Her throat moved as she swallowed. Neither are you. That night, he sat beside her while she mended socks. He did not touch her, but their shoulders brushed every so often. The fire cracked softly, and outside the wind howled. You ever want more? He asked. More what? Than this. Than surviving. I want a home that stays. I want my boys to sleep without fear. I want a man who does not walk away. He reached out, gently took the needle from her hand, and set it down. His fingers held hers for a moment too long. I will never walk away. She looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes, but she smiled. You better mean that, Ranger Holt. He squeezed her hand.
Ido.
By the time spring crept into the valley, the house was full of sound. Laughter. Hammering. Ranger had added a second bedroom, so the boys could have their own space. Georgia planted a garden out back. The boys ran wild in the fields, chasing each other with sticks and shouting about bandits and heroes. One warm evening, Georgia stood at the stove, stirring stew while sunlight spilled through the window. Ranger leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with quiet awe. You make this place feel alive, he said. You made space for us. He crossed to her, rested his hand against her waist, gentle and sure. She turned, letting the spoon rest in the pot. Their eyes met again, and this time, neither of them looked away. He cupped her face and kissed her slow, certain, and full of everything they had not said. When they pulled back, she rested her forehead against his. I think I fell in love with you somewhere between the cornbread and the quilting. He smiled, thumb brushing her cheek. I fell in love with the woman beside the stove. Georgia laughed softly, wrapping her arms around his neck. Guess we both found what we were looking for. And that evening, as supper simmered and the boys chased fireflies outside, Ranger held Georgia close in the kitchen that had brought them together. Neither of them would ever be alone again. The first true melt came in late March. The creek behind the barn, quiet and still through the winter, began to chatter again, swollen with thaw. Ranger stood knee-deep in the mud near the fence line, hammering in a post Rowan helped him carry, the boy's shoulders set with pride. Think this one'll hold? Rowan asked, squinting at the wood. Ranger tested it with a tug. Good work. You've got the arm for it. Rowan's grin was all teeth, and he took off running toward the pasture, boots kicking up wet earth. Georgia watched from the porch, an old apron tied around her waist, sleeves rolled. Her hands were red from scrubbing, but her back was straight and her eyes steady. You reckon he'll be a rancher? She asked when Ranger came inside later, dripping from the knees down. He's got the makings, Ranger said, setting his hat on the peg by the door. He listens. Picks things up quick. She poured hot water into a basin and set it on the table. He never had a man to learn from. Now he does. She looked up, brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek. You sure you're ready for that? 2 boys, and me besides. I don't take on things I don't mean to carry. Georgia didn't answer. She wrung out a rag and passed it to him to wash the mud from his hands. Her touch lingered a moment longer than it needed to. That night, while Russ slept curled beneath a quilt Georgia had pieced from old dresses and Rowan snored faintly in the next room, Ranger sat beside the fire with her. She was mending again. This time a pair of worn trousers Russell had put a hole through sliding down the barn ladder. You always this quiet when the house is still? She asked, not looking up. Never had much reason to speak before. She gave a soft breath that might have been a laugh. You speak when it matters. He looked at her hands, careful and quick, working the needle through the fabric. You miss anything from Kansas? She hesitated. There was a grove of oaks near the house. I used to sit there with the boys on hot days. But it's not the trees I miss. It's knowing we had a place of our own,
even if it didn't last.
He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. You have one now. Georgia met his gaze, her eyes unreadable for a long moment. Then she set the trousers aside. You mean that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. She folded her hands in her lap, fingers laced together. I still sleep light. Like I'm listening for someone to take it all away again. I'll keep watch, he said. Her throat moved as she swallowed. You make it sound easy. It isn't, but it's worth the work. The next morning, she rose early, as always, but left the kitchen window open to let the smell of new grass drift in. Ranger noticed a small bundle on the table when he came in from the barn, biscuits wrapped in cloth, a wedge of dried apple, and a note in her handwriting that simply read, "For your ride to town." He rode into Rollins that day to pick up supplies. The general store was low on flour, but he found a bag of dried beans and a bolt of muslin Georgia could use for curtains. She'd mentioned once, in passing, how the setting sun came in hard through the west window and woke Russ too early. He remembered that. It stayed with him. By the time he returned, the boys had dragged a crooked bench onto the porch, Rowan carving something into the rail with his pocket knife while Russ chased chickens. Georgia stood over a tub, wringing sheets, her sleeves wet to the elbows. I brought you something, Ranger said, lifting the muslin from the saddlebag. She took it, eyes flicking from the fabric to his face. You remembered. I remember everything you say. She didn't speak, just reached out and brushed her fingers lightly over his wrist, the contact brief but certain. That night, when the wind picked up and the sky turned the color of pewter, Ranger lit the lamp in the front room and found Georgia standing at the window, watching the dark settle in. I never expected to feel safe again, she said without turning. Not really. Not in that deep-down, quiet way. He stepped close, his voice low. You're safe now. And not just because the doors are locked or the roof holds. Because you're not carrying it alone anymore. She turned then, slowly, and he saw something in her face he hadn't before, something not just grateful, but open, willing. I stopped hoping for more than a place to sleep. Then you showed up with your silence and your kind eyes and gave me everything I didn't dare ask for. He reached for her then, no rush, just a steady hand to the small of her back, guiding her closer. She fit against him like she'd always been meant to. Her head rested beneath his chin, her breath warm against his shirt. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but inside, they stood still, the lamp casting gold across the floorboards. He didn't promise her anything more than he could keep, and she didn't need to hear anything he hadn't already shown her. When they finally kissed again, it wasn't something new. It was simply the next right thing. By late April, the cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out in pale green, and the calves in the lower pasture kicked their legs in the warming sun. Ranger finished replacing the latch on the feed shed door and spotted Georgia kneeling by the garden bed, her hands sunk into the dark soil. She'd drawn a line with twine between two stakes and was pressing seeds into place with quiet precision. He walked over, crouched beside her. What are you planting? Turnips, she said, brushing dirt from her palm. And some carrots if the ground's loose enough. He picked up a small cloth bag she left open, the top folded back. Didn't know you had seed for all this. Mrs. Latham brought a few packets when she came from town last week. Said they were leftover from her husband's store. Ranger ran his thumb over the paper label. She's the one with the big red barn, near the split in the road? Georgia nodded. Told me she used to grow everything they needed before her rheumatism set in. Said it was good luck to pass seeds on. He looked at her hands as she pressed another row into place. You believe in luck? She sat back on her heels, brushing a curl behind her ear with the back of her wrist. I believe in what people give when they don't have to. Russ came running down the slope from the house, a wooden spoon in one hand.
Ma.
Rowan says he saw a snake by the woodpile. Georgia stood at once, wiping her palms on her skirt. Where is he now? Still watching it. He's got a stick. Ranger was already moving up the hill. By the time he reached the stack, Rowan stood a good distance back, his eyes locked on a coil of brown and gray tucked in the shadows. Don't step close, Ranger said, voice steady but firm. Rowan didn't move. It's not rattling. Doesn't need to. Could still be quick. He eased forward, picked up a long-handled shovel from beside the shed, and used it to shift the top log. When the snake slithered free, Ranger pinned it fast and firm, then carried it out to the brush. Rowan let out a breath. I didn't want to kill it. Didn't have to. Just needed to keep your brother safe. Georgia had reached the yard by then, Russ clutching her skirt. Her eyes flicked to the empty spot where the snake had been. Everyone all right? No one got hurt, Ranger said. But might be time to teach Rowan how to tell the safe ones from the rest. She nodded. I'd like that. That evening, they ate by lantern light on the porch, the boys passing cornbread between them while Georgia poured water from the tin pitcher. The air held the scent of damp earth and lilac from the bush near the steps. You ever think about adding chickens? She asked, passing Ranger a plate of beans and salt bacon. He chewed a moment before answering.
Thought about it.
Never had the hands to keep up. I could manage them. Maybe put a coop behind the smokehouse. He set his fork down. You want to stay. For good. She didn't flinch. I wouldn't have brought it up if I didn't. Their eyes held. Then he reached across the table, slow and sure, and covered her hand with his. You're not just part of the house, Georgia. This place is better because you're here. She looked down at their fingers, then back up. You make it feel like it was always meant to be. Later, after the boys had gone inside to wash up, Georgia stayed behind to gather the plates. Ranger took the last bite of apple preserve and leaned back in his chair, boots crossed at the ankle. You ever think about what you want next? She asked, stacking the tinware into a basket. He looked out at the darkening fields. I'd like a barn that doesn't leak. A new fence line on the east pasture. And you beside me, every morning and night. She stopped moving. That last part. You sure? I've never been more sure of anything. She set the basket down and stepped toward him. Then you'd better ask proper. He stood, slow and quiet, and took her hand. Georgia Dale, will you marry me and build this life together? She leaned into him, her voice warm against his collar.
Yes.
And I'll plant carrots every spring, just to be certain we've got something growing. He kissed her under the porch lamp, with the scent of lilac on the air and the stars just beginning to come out. Inside, the boys' laughter echoed faintly through the open windows, and the house, for the first time in many years, felt entirely full. The wedding was small. No preacher from town, just a traveling circuit rider who happened by with his mule and a worn Bible. He read the words with a voice like dry leaves, and Georgia wore a dress she'd sewn from faded muslin and leftover lace from an old hem. Ranger stood beside her, clean-shaven and nervous beneath his calm. The boys held still for once, Rowan in boots too big and Russ clutching a sprig of wild sage he'd picked for her bouquet. They said their vows under the cottonwoods near the creek, the branches just beginning to bud. When the rider tucked his Bible away and nodded, Georgia reached for Ranger's hand without hesitation. He kissed her once, long enough to steady them both, and then they walked back up the slope toward the house they'd built into something whole. By early May, the sun had begun to rise earlier, and Georgia switched the kitchen window curtains for thinner ones. The garden pushed up green shoots, and she caught Russ sneaking handfuls of young radish tops to the goats. The house had settled into a rhythm not easy, but steady each day built on the last. One afternoon, Ranger came back from the far pasture with his hands wrapped in torn linen. Georgia met him at the door, her apron already tied, and let him in without a word. She sat him at the table, unwrapped the cloth, and clucked softly at the deep scrape running along his palm. What happened? Fence post broke under me. Got dragged a ways before the rope gave. She poured boiled water over the wound, dabbing gently with a clean rag. You should have sent for Rowan. He's not ready to handle a wild gelding on his own. You'd rather bleed out than ask for help? I'd rather not spook the boy. She paused, tying the bandage tight. You're not alone anymore, remember? He looked down at her hands, steady as they tied the knot. I'm still learning that. Georgia didn't answer, but she kissed his temple before standing. That night, she rubbed liniment into his shoulders and said nothing about him wincing when she reached the bruise along his ribs. As the days lengthened, Ranger taught Rowan how to shoe a horse. Georgia caught him once, watching the boy from the corner of the barn, his expression unreadable. Later, she found him on the porch, oiling his saddle. You thinking about something? She asked, sitting beside him. He kept his gaze on the leather. I never thought I'd have someone following in my steps. He's not just following. He's watching to see how you walk. He nodded slowly. I want to do right by him. You already are. He set the saddle aside and turned toward her. When I was a boy, my father left before I could even remember the sound of his voice. I used to stare at the barn door each evening, thinking maybe today he'd come riding back. Georgia folded her hands in her lap. Did he?
No.
But I remember every man who stayed. She leaned her head against his shoulder. That's what our boys will remember, too. In early June, Georgia woke before dawn to the sound of thunder far off to the west. She stoked the stove, brewed coffee, and watched the sky darken. A storm was coming, the kind that flattened crops and split trees. She found Ranger already outside, tying down the tool shed roof. The wind pulled at his coat, and she shouted over the gale. Do you need me to bring the boys to the root cellar? Not yet, he yelled back. But keep them close. She gathered Russ and Rowan inside and made them sit in the pantry with a blanket and a tin of biscuits. The storm broke just after noon, a wall of rain and wind that rattled the windows and sent branches flying past the porch. Ranger came and soaked through, his face streaked with dirt and water. Barn held, he said, stripping off his coat. Lost part of the chicken coop. We'll have to fix it when the ground's dry. Are the animals all right? All but one hen. Fox must have gotten her before the worst of it. She brought him dry clothes and helped him peel off his shirt. His back was scraped raw where flying bark had caught him. She washed the cut with salt water, her hands gentle. You ever think you'd be nursing a man back from storm damage instead of mending socks? I'd rather mend you. That night, with the storm past and the boys asleep, they lay in bed with the windows open. The air smelled of wet grass and pine. Ranger ran his fingers down her arm. I used to think quiet was the same as peace, he said. But it was just emptiness. And now it's full. You talking to the chickens. Russ trying to count stars. Rowan asking how to braid rope. She turned toward him in the dark. We made something good, didn't we? He pulled her close. Better than I ever imagined. Outside, the night hummed with frogs and the distant drone of the creek. Inside, they held each other, not out of need, but choice. And with every breath, Georgia knew the life they'd built wasn't just shelter, it was home.
The summer came in dry.
Dust clung to the porch posts and coated the windowsills, and the creek behind the barn ran slower than it had in years. Georgia kept a bucket by the standpipe and rationed every ladle to the garden. She taught Russ to watch the leaves for droop and how to press a finger into the dirt to check for moisture, whispering to him like the plants could hear. One afternoon, with the sun hanging low and heavy behind the hills, Ranger walked up from the south pasture with a folded slip of paper in his hand. The corners were curled, the ink sun faded. He passed it to Georgia as she stood at the table stringing beans.
From the land office, he said.
She wiped her hands on her apron and took it. Her eyes skimmed the page, then lifted to meet his. They approved the deed transfer. He nodded. It's ours. Fully. No liens, no back claims. She held the paper like it was something alive. You didn't tell me you were filing. I wanted to wait until it was certain. Her fingers traced the name at the top, his name, then the small addition beneath it, written in newer ink. And wife. She folded it carefully and tucked it between the pages of the old recipe book she kept near the stove. I never expected to have my name on land again. You earned it same as I did.
More, she said.
I just didn't know a thing like this could come from what we started with. Outside, the wind picked up, bending the clothesline. A sheet snapped loose and trailed across the yard. Georgia stepped out barefoot to catch it, and Ranger watched her from the doorway, the sun catching the tips of her hair and turning them to copper. That evening, Georgia lit a lantern and sat beside Rowan as he copied words from a primer onto a slate. She pointed out letters he'd reversed, her voice quiet but firm. When the boy finished, he turned to Ranger. Can I help with the branding tomorrow? Ranger glanced at Georgia, who nodded once. You can, he said, but you'll hold the gate and watch the fire. No iron yet. Rowan puffed up a little, but didn't argue. Russ was already asleep on the floor, curled up with the dog they'd taken in over spring. Later, when the house had gone still, Georgia and Ranger sat by the open window, the lamp turned low. He ran his hand along the edge of her chair, his fingers brushing hers where they rested on the armrest. You ever think we'd get here? He asked. I didn't let myself, she said. Hope was too heavy to carry when I was on my own. Now it sits easier. He turned her hand over, tracing the lines on her palm. There's something I've been thinking on. She looked over at him, her face half lit in the lamplight. I want to build another room off the back, he said. Something with space for a cradle, should we ever need one. Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. You think we might? I'd like to try. She reached up and touched his cheek, her thumb brushing the place just beneath his eye. Then let's try. Not because we need more, but because we've got enough to give. They rose together, the chair creaking behind her, and crossed the room without a word. He kissed her slowly, the kind that didn't ask or promise anything more than what already was a life, shared fully. Weeks passed. Ranger built the new room with Rowan's help. Georgia hemmed new curtains from flour sacks and taught Russ to string beans for drying. A neighbor passed by with a pair of laying hens he no longer needed, and Georgia bartered preserves for them. The garden yielded squash and onions, and they stacked firewood early, before the frost could find them. One afternoon, Georgia stood at the edge of the corral, one hand resting lightly across her belly. She wasn't showing yet, but she knew. She hadn't told Ranger, not with words, but he'd started stoking the stove before she came down in the mornings and left her the last biscuit without being asked. They had ways of knowing each other now that didn't need much explaining. That night, she laid his hand over the soft rise beneath her ribs, and he didn't speak, just held her close and let his breath slow in time with hers. By autumn, the boys had taken to sleeping in a loft above the new room, their laughter echoing through the rafters. The chickens clucked beneath the window, and the air smelled of smoke and cider. Georgia stitched tiny clothes by the fire, and Ranger carved a cradle from pine cut near the creek. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills and the maples turned to flame, they walked the pasture path hand in hand. The wind stirred dry grass against their boots, and a hawk circled high above the ridge. Do you miss the quiet? Georgia asked. Ranger squeezed her hand. This is the best kind of quiet, the kind that's full. They stopped beneath the cottonwoods, where they'd stood that day in spring. The leaves rustled above them, gold and brittle. You gave me more than a home, she said. You gave me back the part of myself I thought was gone for good. He kissed her forehead, then her mouth, slow and certain. You gave me the rest of my life. And there, beneath the trees, with the wind curling around them, They stood in the fullness of everything they'd built and everything still coming. The days ahead would bring cold and snow, and after that, the green of another spring. But for now, the world held still around them, wrapped in light and warmth and the quiet grace of a life fully theirs.